Good morning, everybody. The relationship between corporate and creative is changing. So where does the new balance of power lie? Is there a perfect mean? Does it vary from brand to brand? And what does all the flux that we're seeing now mean for the future of the business, particularly in the ways that we structure companies and also the type of talent that we can attract to luxury in the future? I've got two fantastic panelists here to tell me more. Sonu Shivdasani, who is the CEO, founder, chairman, and chief architect of the Soneva Group, and Reed Krakoff, who, as we know, was recently appointed as chief artistic officer at Tiffany. So, Reed, I thought I would start with you on this because, you know, you have your own eponymous luxury brand. You were at Coach for a long time as executive creative director, and now you are chief artistic officer. What does chief artistic officer mean?
So, thank you, by the way. Tiffany has long been organized in a certain way. It was founded in 1837. It has been essentially broken up into a few different creative areas overseen by C.E.O. And up until not quite a year ago when I joined, there was a design group, an architecture group, PR group, and a marketing group under the CEO. And then, of course, on the other side of the business was manufacturing, sourcing, retail, and all of the business side functions. I was fortunate enough to arrive at a time when the company was rethinking how it was structured and potentially looking to organize the creative side of the business under one person. And it was something that was a new idea for Tiffany. It obviously has done extraordinarily well for many years, structured in a more traditional way. So to describe the title, or to inform what it is about the title, Chief Artistic Officer, versus what I was in my past at Coach, Executive Creative Director, it's less about the title, and it's more about the need to sort of harness the creative side of the business in concert with the leadership of the CEO.
So do you have more power?
Just between us.
Where's the CEO? They're not in the CEO's not in the audience.
You're going to ask me that. I thought she was the one who asked me. That's not a word I would use. My success, Tiffany's success, all of our success within the Tiffany Group is all so intermingled and codependent that it's just not a word I would use. I think I have more tools to help the company be successful. Absolutely. In my past, I've gotten a lot of questions around, it's too much responsibility under one person, how do you manage all these things? And the reality is, it's much easier where one person can adjudicate between all these functions, because the nature of people in general, but particularly creative people, if you have a brand, you have an architect, a designer, a marketing person. The architect wants to work with Richard Meyer. The PR person wants to have the Costume Institute sponsor. The marketing person wants to work with a different photographer, and everyone sort of tries to make their way towards a compromise or towards their way towards something that feels like a holistic decision. But I don't think it's possible, actually. And in addition to that, you have to also respond to the needs of the business. So all of those different things, from a creative point of view, to the needs of the business, to the need and the desire of the CEO who's leading this charge, it's very difficult with multiple people. And I think, I think of myself as much a brand architect and steward as I do a creative person. So for me, it makes it much easier if there's not that natural give and take between all these different factions, just by the nature of we're all people that have a particular view of what we want to do.
Actually, I'd say that just to build on what Reed's saying, I'd actually say that that's fundamental. I mean, it's essential, isn't it, for a luxury brand? If you think about the origins of luxury, it's people who are once passionate about making a handbag or luggage or jewelry, and they made all the decisions. Think about Steve Jobs and Apple recently. He had a huge say on how things worked, and success is by that because you have consistency throughout. Luxury is not about making compromises. It's not Of course, lots of people, to be successful, you need lots of talented people to help you. But there has to be one very clear vision. And I think that we found that certainly in our business, that my wife's the creative director, I'm the chief architect, although I'm a bit concerned I have too many titles. You made me sound like an African dictator, we're very involved, and we might not be as talented as the various individuals that some of our competitors use, but what's very clear is that there's a consistency because there are a few people who are creating an overall theme through. Of course, we'll get lots of inspiration from other people, and we'll have very talented people within us. But I feel that it's really the only way that a luxury brand can be strong, is to really have that, to have one individual. Just like the origins of all of these brands. There was one founder who was very strong, and they did make lots of decisions, and that's what luxury misses sometimes when it becomes institutional. That's the challenge.
Clearly, you agree on that, and that there needs to be a clear, singular vision in order to really succeed creatively in this era. But you also do hold sort of both sides. You're on both sides of the table, if you like. You are CEO on the corporate side, but you are also heavily involved in the design side. How do you balance that out?
It's. I think it's just the essence of the business in that, if you are about creating unique experiences, as the CEO, you really need to drive that and play a role in that. It's very important, I believe, that companies must have a purpose beyond just enriching their shareholders, which happens to be ourselves, and our employees. When you can do that, it can be very powerful. It can be very engaging for your employees. And the CEO needs to drive all aspects of that. So our core purpose is slow life, which is essentially offering our guests luxuries whilst minimizing our impact on the planet and enhancing their health. And it's not something I can delegate. It's got to come from the core. I, as the CEO, our CFO, my deputy CEO, they've also got to be passionate about those values and drive it forward. You can't have, I heard yesterday someone mentioning that they're outsourcing sustainability, so they've hired someone to set up policies or whatever. It doesn't work. It's got to come from the core team, and that's how sustainability is driven, or creativity is driven, or the values are driven. The key team, including the CFO, have to share that, not some department head or whatever.
I'm curious to hear from both of you, and we talked a little bit about this before the panel started, but why is this era in particular more than ever one where the creative needs to have that power? Is it because we live in a more visual age? Is it the digital era? How much is digital driving this? How much is driven by the way that we're living outside in luxury?
That's one question. Okay. That's a good question. I mean, my sense of how creatives are seen today versus 20 years ago, at least in my 20-odd years in the industry, creatives were more in the design room when I first started. It was run by the business, there was a merchant, and there were designers. Then there was a period, let's say, around the mid-90s, when the idea of creative director came about. And the pendulum swung in the other direction. I think now, after that experience, we've all lived through that. Today, we've met somewhere in the middle, where the business side and the creative side, to some extent, are indistinguishable from each other, and I do believe that. I think that, particularly a big business, a public business, it's a puzzle. It's not, I'd probably say too much, but it's not about a pretty shoe or a beautiful piece of jewelry. It's about the right piece at the right time, at the right price, in the right geography, for the right consumer. And to know that, it's really similar to what you were saying. It's almost a code and a sequence of decisions that makes each one valuable. It's really not an absolute scale of the most creative person landing in a company and just being the best shoe designer or the best jeweler, let's say. It's really understanding the holistic nature of what you're trying to accomplish, so that interaction between business and creative, it's impossible to do it without that. Now, does it have something to do with today's culture, social media, transparency? I don't, actually, it's funny, I don't think so. I think it's more to do with the complexity and the speed of business than it is with transparency and social media and the fact that everyone sees everything. Clearly, there's an issue around the business side in terms of pricing and where a consumer buys something and where they can find something 24/7. You can find any handbag at any price, anywhere. That's one piece. But in terms of this link between creative and business, I think it has more to do with the competitive nature of the landscape. I mean, when I joined Coach, I was telling someone the other day, there were no handbag companies essentially compared to today. If you were to go to Bergdorf's today, there's probably 50 brands that did not exist. That's not exaggeration. There was no designer handbags, essentially. You know, there was Prada, Gucci, LV, Fendi, Coach, a few others. The competition today is so intense that there's that need for that commingling and that play between the both sides. And that to me is why the creative has made its way over to, let's say, the business side, and the business side has made its way over into the creative side. It's just, to me, it's competition and difficulty in the market.
I think this will build on what Reed's saying. I think a couple of things. One is, in our industry, in sort of luxury, where we're creating unique creations for our clients, you need to balance the left brain and the right brain. And it's quite difficult to find people who have that in themselves as an individual. So then you need to create a team where that is balanced. So I think that's important. And I think this other point about the creators playing more of a role is exactly what Reed just built on. I don't think it's anything to do with the digital economy or that aspect. It's just that luxury's become very institutional, and fewer and fewer companies own more and more brands. And what is the difference between one and the other? I mean, we see it in our industry where most luxury hotel companies are growing through managing other people's hotels. So they have many brands, and they're quite confused internally as to what each brand stands for. I mean, do you know what the difference is between a St. Regis and a Ritz-Carlton? They're not very clear internally themselves. And then the other thing is then the owners are these big institutions, have many, many hotels in their portfolio. And with the same architects, same interior designers, and same asset managers. So over time, the difference between one and the other just becomes the name on the door. And I think that's quite a risk. And I think the same story that we experience in the hotel industry could apply to the luxury goods industry. So I think your point is correct, is that there are so many handbags now that all look quite similar. You're not going to create a margin and achieve something unique by just creating another handbag a little bit cheaper or positioning in the right position. You're going to have to create something special and something unique. And in our industry, it's about creating unique experiences. When we create resorts, I refer to them as the apps. So we used to own and operate a company called Six Senses, which owned and managed more hotels, but we were mainly a manager there of other hotels. And one of the challenges I had with the third-party owners that owned the actual hotels, which were Six Senses, was to explain to them that we weren't just creating a room and a restaurant. It wasn't just about rooms and food and beverage. Actually in the hotel industry, in a P&L, it says rooms, food and beverage, and it says MOD, minor operating department. So the spa and all of that, the diving, that's called minor operating department. When you're a resort, it's why people come,
And come
spa,
back.
yeah. And so we started with spas, introducing spas into our hotels, and owners said, okay, now we'll put a spa in. And those sort of things you could get them across, but things like an observatory or an open-air cinema where people can see the stars, in the sky, not just on the screen, the largest telescope in the Indian Ocean, or just focusing on that incredible, experience that the team have just created, whether it's a special boat where the kitchen goes to the villa or whatever. Those little touches, we used to call them the apps. It's a bit like, and I used to explain, I said, what you're doing is you're investing $100 million in an iPhone, but then you're not buying any apps. And I think that element needs to come from creative people, and one needs to stimulate that. And if one becomes too corporate, what happens is, I suppose in a goods industry as well, all you're doing is you're creating the room and the a beautiful room with a beautiful pool and a nice restaurant, but you're not creating the experiences. And I think that's where the creative team can help. And those little bits, in our industry at least, those little apps, as we call them, that 5% for, the tree pod at Soneva Kiri, where people board at the bottom and go up into the trees, or the water slide from our villas, or the fact that you press a button, the roof slides back so you can see the stars. Those little things might be 5% of your total project costs, but they end up doubling your room revenues because that's what people remember. I mean, we've had 50 million viral views on Facebook on just someone going down a slide, a guest going down a slide and pressing the button and sliding the roof back and filming that. So that's very important. So I think that's why creative is more important now, because how do you differentiate from the pack? The CEO is not going to do that. The creative people are, and so you need to let them do that.
Something I guess we need to think about, though, is as these sort of shifting demands become more and more prevalent, who is the talent of tomorrow? We were talking before again about, time was that the creative director would come from Central St. Martin's or Parsons, the CEO would have come from an MBA school or worked their way through a company. And now, do corporates need to be more creative? Do creatives need to be more corporate? Who are we going to attract to this business going into the future?
So I think what you just said is absolutely the truth. The creative side and the corporate side has to have an overlap. I think each one has a role that they have to be responsible for, and ultimately they have to make the decision. But there has to be a respect and an overlap and an understanding. It's probably the most difficult part, that I need to understand margins, and I need to understand stock price, and I need to understand SG&A and all those fun things. They also need to understand product cadence, marketing investment. I mean, how do you make, it's funny, I've had this conversation many, many times. Someone's a great business person, but they don't know the business. How do you make a decision on something when it's all just numbers on a page? By the same token, as someone that is a great creative person, but if they've never experienced design, or if they've never been in this business, it's hard to abstract those ideas and make a strong decision. So it's experience. I think experience is number one, always, at least in my world. You have to have experience what it is to make those decisions, to lead a team, to go through a creative process and understand what you're going to run into, because there always are problems. Always, you want to do this, the company can't do that. You can afford this material, you can't afford that material. It's a constantly moving organic process, the creative side, so you really have to know what to expect. On the business side as well, you have to understand those ebbs and flows, those surprises. Design and creativity is not a straight line. You have to be prepared for mistakes, for things that are not looking the way you hope they would look, for the market shifting, for things that aren't successful. So unless the two sides really understand what the other is going through, it's difficult to be supportive. It's difficult to make the right decisions. So I think you need people, I hate to say it, but experience, again, is number one. Number two is people that have an open mind. I've been lucky enough to work for a few business leaders, CEOs, who have forced me, that's the word I would use, to be educated on the other side of the business. At the time, I wasn't thrilled, to be honest. I would rather be in the design studio or working on something else, but I'm so thankful now that I can sit in a boardroom, or I can sit with someone from Wall Street and talk about all the things that give them confidence that I know what I'm doing. And at the same time, it helps me to have a real dialogue with the CEO. There's really nothing that he or she shouldn't be able to ask me, and vice versa, that we shouldn't be able to have a balanced conversation about, to challenge each other. So I think what's different about before is this idea of a designer who, and I came from Parsons, we talked about Parsons and Central St. Martin's. The idea of a designer in an ivory tower just doesn't exist anymore. You have to be open. You have to understand that it's not a one-man show. It really is about teams. It's about leading groups of people and getting them to accept things that often aren't what we want to do or what the business side wants to do. There has to be that confidence and that perseverance, that belief in what you're doing as a group is worth doing, which is very different than my first job where I worked for I was an illustrator at Ralph Lauren. I sat in a room and sketched dresses, and it's just a very different time. You have
and
to
you did
be,
as you were told rather than, you know.
at least, yeah. At least, very much so. It's just a different time. It's a different skill set, and it's a much more holistic view from both sides. So to me, that's the biggest difference. People that are modern thinkers, that are contemporary culture bound, that understand what's happening in the world and don't want to just be. There was a time when creatives and fashion designers, it's hard to do it today, they could kind of exist in their own world. There's a very, very few that are fortunate enough to have a vision and have the patience to have their vision bear out, but it's more and more rare, more and more rare.
Yeah, I think what Reed's saying is almost, having the CEO from Parsons or St. Martin's and the creative director who's done the MBA. And I think that's sort of more and more possible because, we live in a different world today. So, traditionally, we'd go to school, go to university, and the general view was, okay, we've stopped our learning now. Learning was boring, and now we go and get a job. And we don't really spend time learning. But I think today, with, the digital environment, the availability of online courses, MOOCs, etc., more and more people understand that there's a culture of continuous learning. So, that's one thing as a CEO I continuously drive is that our team are continuously learning. We certainly, when we get our group together for every 6 months, I spend a day and I'm teaching them. It's not, we don't go through numbers and all that. One day is some of the core layer sharing what they've learned over the last 6 months. We get our hosts, we call our employees hosts. They come and share what they've learned. And we're continuously learning. For example, I read that an engineer who's 40, if he hasn't continued learning, he has half the knowledge of someone who's just graduated as an engineer, because the world's just changing so quickly. So we have to continue to learn. So I think this idea of a creative director who's done an MBA or vice versa, a CEO who's done a course in design or whatever is very possible today. And so and I think that's the world we live in. And I think to survive as an organization, as a group of people, we have to continue to learn because it's uplifting for one to learn and to continue to improve oneself. I think it's very motivating. It's very passion. It drives passion amongst your team. So that's one thing that I try and sort of encourage a lot. Yeah.
One more question from me, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. We started the panel by saying, is there a perfect mean? Is there something that can be consistent across every brand? But then ultimately we've discussed that the sectors within luxury can be very different, the brands can be very different. What do you think? Is there a perfect balance that everyone can reach, or is it every case unto itself?
I think it's becoming more and more unique for each brand because of the fact that, as you stated, it's such a crowded market now. You really have to define why the world needs another handbag or why the world needs another clothing brand. I think each brand has its, I've said many times that brands are like people. They kind of do certain things, they don't do other things. They may stretch to do things that surprise you, but they kind of operate within a world of a personality. And I think each brand is unique in that way. So the path to success is, I think each brand it's a bit of a mystery until you begin down that path. So I couldn't tell you one that there is a perfect balance. You just have to, I think, pursue an idea to understand what a brand really can and can't be.
I would say that if one looks across sectors of the economy, I'd say even in industrialized sectors now, one has to have at the senior level a balance between the right brain, the left brain, the creativity, and the numbers and the discipline, etc. And that needs to be there. It's whether you're an aviation company or a manufacturer of just basic products. I think in the business we're in, creating experiences where people will pay a fortune and people have the ability and the interest and inclination to pay a fortune. I think it's the opposite. I think it has to be about 75% creative and 25% the sort of the left brain aspect, because in our industry you have the opportunity to command double the revenues of your competitor if you do something brilliant. And I'm not familiar with the other sectors and the good sectors, but certainly in our business, I've seen that happen where hotels have opened and they've commanded average rates and revenue per room of double anything that existed at the time or any competitor, and it's through a few unique, compelling things that they've done. And so I think creativity can be rewarded at the luxury level because people are willing to pay. There's a lot of cash around. People will pay if they feel that there's value, and value is about not the discount and how cheap it is. It's about how unique an experience it is.
If you've been able to sell them the dream. So are there any questions from the audience? No? No? There we go, we've got one here.
You've described your approach to increasing the literacy of the creative and the business sides of each other, largely as an apprenticeship with experience and the odd biannual teaching moments. Are there more formal efforts in the company to identify those who can bridge the gap and to encourage them to keep learning and be more literate of both sides?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think that we do champion creativity. We have structured innovation sessions. So every property will have 3 sessions per quarter with a broad set of people. So people from different teams. It could be a housekeeper, a villa attendant, a waiter, different levels, different spheres within the organization. We have 3 spheres: the core, the inner sphere, and the atmosphere. So within those 3 spheres. And that obviously stimulates them to be creative at the same time. But you also have people who are very left brain and they're in the same session and they're being exposed as well. So I think that balance happens through greater communication, allowing bottom-up creativity as well as top-down creativity. So that's one thing we try and stimulate is this idea of structured innovation. I think it's all companies need to be creative. We talk about creativity a lot, but creativity needs a railway track. It's like a bullet train. Without the railway track, it goes nowhere. And so, in a way, once you give them a clear guiding principle of what to drive the creativity on, then that helps. That stimulates them, and then they become someone who normally wouldn't come up with an interesting idea or think he was capable of does, and then he's rewarded and recognized and then he comes up with more ideas. So, for example, if you come up with an idea at Soneva that can be measured in terms of costs reduction or revenue improvements, you get 10% of that for the first year. And in one case, someone was paid $100,000. He was a junior host. His salary was only $3,000 a month. So I think that's a way you can get the teams below to start thinking. And also culture. I mean, as a CEO, my prime role is to drive a culture. How do you do that? You do it through language. We have about 500 words we use. I mentioned host. We like every employee. We want our employees to be owners. So we want 350 owners in our hotels, not one. So that's why we call them hosts. You call an employee host, they behave like a host. You call them an employee, they'll behave like an employee. And so we have lots of things like that drive the language. And then various best practices and ways we approach and the ways we behave and how we reinforce our values on a daily basis. And I think that stimulates the creativity from below up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's it. So a round of applause, please. And I'll welcome Stephen on.